Have you ever felt so lost that even the sound of your own footsteps seemed to echo in emptiness? In the silent vastness of the desert, a cowboy wandered aimlessly. The sun scorched his skin, the dry wind carried dust that clung to his face, and with every mile he wondered if there was still a place left to return to. He wasn't just carrying a worn saddle and an almost empty canteen. He also bore an invisible weight, memories that hurt more than any wound, broken promises, and the silence of someone who no longer had anyone to talk to. That man wasn't running from an enemy. He was running from himself. Each step was an attempt to forget the past, but the past is stubborn. It always finds a way to walk beside you. Have you ever felt that way? The feeling that no matter how far you try to get, something insists on following you? Well, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to find out may surprise you. The landscape around him was an endless sea of sand and rock. The horizon shimmered under the heat, and the only trail was the one he left behind. There was no compass, no map, no clear destination. The cowboy only knew he had to keep walking, maybe to stay alive, maybe so he wouldn't have to face the memories that haunted him whenever he stopped. Then suddenly, in the middle of an almost suffocating silence, a small figure appeared in the distance. It was a native boy, barefoot, dressed in simple clothes, with a steady gaze. He seemed out of place in that vast nothingness. Or maybe it was the other way around. Maybe the cowboy was the one who didn't belong there. They stared at each other for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. In that moment, there were no words, only the strange feeling that something important was about to happen. The man hesitated. He didn't know if he should approach. The boy, however, showed no sign of fear. On the contrary, his gaze carried a disarming calm, as if he knew exactly who that cowboy was and where he needed to go. A slight nod, almost imperceptible, was enough to break the stillness. The boy turned and began to walk, without looking back, as if expecting the cowboy to follow him. And this is where something changes. Deep down, the cowboy didn't know why he took that first step after the boy. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to hear a human voice after days alone. Or maybe it was just that inexplicable feeling that if he didn't follow now, he would lose something he would never find again. Have you ever felt that? As they walked, the distance between them grew shorter, but the silence remained. The boy didn't say a word, yet every gesture seemed full of meaning. Sometimes he looked back, just to make sure the man was still there. And with each step, the landscape seemed to shift subtly. It was no longer just sand and stone. Now there were shadows of distant trees and a slightly cooler air. The cowboy didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't care. Something inside told him that this path and this boy were more important than any destination he could choose on his own. And what he was about to discover, as their footsteps echoed in the desert, would not only change his route, but reveal a truth he never imagined he would find. As he followed the boy's steps, the cowboy began to realize that the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. It was as if every grain of sand beneath his feet carried a story he didn't yet know. The sun, once merciless, now felt softer, and the wind, which had once cut his skin, now carried the distant scent of damp earth. Something was changing, not just in the path, but inside him. And this is where I want to make space for you. What do you feel when you hear a story like this? Have you ever lived a moment when a simple encounter completely changed your direction? If this resonates with you, leave a comment sharing what touched you the most so far. I read every message, and it's from this dialogue that I find the strength to keep telling stories like this one. I also want to ask you for something important. If this narrative has already kept you hooked up to this point, give it a like. It might seem like just a click, but it's that gesture that makes YouTube understand it's worth showing this message to more people. And if you want to keep following emotional and meaningful stories, subscribe to the channel. That way, we can continue this journey together, always finding new paths, some we never imagined existed. Because deep down, every time you comment, like, and subscribe, you're not just supporting this channel, you're helping keep alive the stories that deserve to be told. And speaking of stories, the journey of this cowboy and the native boy was about to reveal something neither of them could have predicted. The cowboy walked with slow steps, like someone carrying far more than the weight of his own body. The sound of spurs, Jingling in the desert silence was the only music accompanying his thoughts. The horizon stretched like an endless line, and every rock, every shadow, seemed to hold a hidden meaning, as if the very landscape wanted to tell him something about himself. The old saddle on his shoulder, the worn hat shielding his eyes from the relentless sun, were signs of a life fully exposed to time and the choices that had shaped his fate. The truth was that he wasn't just lost in a physical sense. There was something deeper, an emptiness that neither drink nor long nights by the fire could fill. It was the weight of decisions that could never be undone, words that should never have been spoken, and silences that had cost too much. A past with invisible scars that still bled every time memories surfaced without warning. In that barren expanse, loneliness wasn't just the absence of people. It was a constant, almost suffocating presence that reminded him of everything he had left behind. He knew that running away wouldn't erase what had happened, but wandering without direction still felt easier than facing the truth. It was as if the dusty road was a reflection of his own soul, dry, cracked, with few signs of life, yet holding a quiet strength to endure. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because there's something curious about the way life guides those who have lost their sense of direction. Sometimes the answers appear in disguise, hidden behind the scenes of seemingly simple encounters. A look, a gesture, a path pointed out by someone you barely know can carry such a profound impact that it changes not only the course of your steps, but your entire mindset. The cowboy didn't know it yet, but every step he took was bringing him closer to a transformation he never imagined he would experience. And it wasn't just an external change, but something that was beginning inside him. The desert, which once felt like a punishment, started to reveal its own secrets. The distant sound of a stream, the flight of a falcon slicing through the sky, the unexpected shadow of a solitary tree, signs that the journey held revelations still to come. It was impossible not to think about life's ironies. How many times had he gotten lost on paths he chose out of pride or fear? How many doors had he closed because he didn't have the courage to admit he needed to go back? And yet, here he was, following a boy he barely knew, as if it were the most natural decision in the world. Perhaps because deep down, the courage to trust someone was the key to unlocking a destiny he thought he had already lost. The contrast was striking. A man carrying the marks of battles the world couldn't see, and a boy with the lightness of someone who still believes the road always leads to a better place. Between them, an invisible bridge was beginning to form, built of silent steps and a trust that required no words. And it's precisely in that space between what is seen and what is felt that the greatest truths are revealed. Because more often than not, the road isn't just a place you pass through, it's the very process that shapes who you will become when you arrive. The weight of the past was like a shadow that never left him. No matter how fast he rode or how many miles he put behind him, there was always that feeling that something was following close, breathing down his neck. And it wasn't a visible enemy. There was no face to hate, no weapon to raise. It was himself, his own conscience, collecting debts that couldn't be paid with gold or land. Years earlier he had a family, a wife who believed in him when no one else did, a young son who ran across the ranch with a smile bright enough to light even the hardest days. But the decisions he made, impulsive and driven by pride, began to corrode everything he had built. Promises were broken, not because he wanted to break them, but because, at the time, he believed he was doing the right thing. Now he knew that the line between right and wrong in the heat of a choice can be thinner than a strand of hair. He remembered one night in particular, heavy rain beating against the roof, a cursed contract on the table, and the voice of a man promising to solve all his problems in exchange for something he knew he could never give. Even so, he signed. That decision set off a chain of events that stripped him of everything that mattered. The ranch was lost, his wife's trust shattered, and the emotional distance turned into real miles until she left without looking back. The memories came in flashes. The smell of fresh coffee in the kitchen, the small hands of his son holding his, the distant sound of laughter in the yard. Each memory also brought the pain of knowing those scenes were now only ghosts. It was like reliving a movie whose behind the scenes he knew by heart, but whose ending he would give anything to rewrite. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because what many people don't realize is that the past isn't just a collection of facts. It shapes our mindset, defines how we make decisions and often dictates the direction of our journey before we even notice. When we don't confront our hidden truths, we carry a weight that affects every step, every relationship, every opportunity. The cowboy understood deep down that the road before him wasn't just a physical path, it was an inner journey, an attempt at redemption. And the presence of that native boy was like a silent reminder that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to find what he had lost. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not in the same place, but in some form that would make sense. As he walked behind the boy, he felt that each step was also a dive into the backstage of his own soul. It was strange to realize that even without saying a word, that boy seemed to know more about him than anyone he had met in years. The boy's gaze didn't judge, but neither did it offer easy comfort. It was like a mirror, reflecting not what he was on the outside, but what he could still be on the inside. He wondered how many people lived trapped by what they had done, or by what they had failed to do, without ever realizing they were only a single act of courage away from starting over. And in the silence of the desert, that revelation seemed as loud as thunder. The sun was already high, burning everything around with a heat that seemed to pierce the skin and reach the bones. The cowboy walked with heavy steps, his hat casting a short shadow over a face marked by time. His eyes, narrowed against the brightness, scanned the horizon for any sign of water, shelter, or life. Then, almost like a mirage, a small figure appeared in the distance. At first, he thought the heat was playing tricks on him. It often did, but as he got closer, the silhouette took shape. It was a boy. Small, thin, his skin baked by the sun and his bare feet, as if the arid ground caused him no discomfort. His clothes were simple, worn from use, but the way he stood, firm and unafraid, carried a silent strength. The cowboy stopped for a moment, taking in the scene. There was something unsettling about that contrast, the boy's physical fragility and the almost impenetrable solidity of his gaze. They stayed that way, separated by a few yards, simply watching each other. The wind stirred small spirals of dust between them, as if the desert itself were curious to see what would happen. The cowboy, a man used to reading people with a single glance, couldn't figure this boy out. He didn't seem afraid nor overly curious. He was just there, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. And, stranger still, as if he had been expecting him all along. The cowboy's hardness, shaped by years of roads, battles, and loss, seemed to waver in the boy's presence. There was no threat, but there was no submission either. It was like looking at something pure, yet carrying a wisdom that didn't come from age. The boy took a step forward, unhurried, and the dry sound of his feet meeting the ground broke the silence. The cowboy didn't move. Part of him wanted to ask who he was, where he came from, why he was alone there. But another part, the part that knew some answers only make sense at the right moment, decided to wait. The boy then made a simple gesture. He lifted his chin slightly, pointing with his eyes toward a direction on the horizon. He said nothing. He simply turned his back and began to walk. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because there are encounters that defy all logic. They happen without warning, break the predictable sequence of our journey, and somehow carry an impact we only recognize later. It's as if life, behind the scenes, were aligning pieces we would never place together on our own. There are decisions we make without understanding, guided only by an instinct we can't explain, and it's in that space, between the unknown and the inevitable, that the greatest revelations often emerge. The cowboy didn't know why he took the first step after that boy. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the heavy silence that needed to be broken, or maybe it was something deeper, the feeling that this boy carried an invisible key to a forgotten part of his story. Each step after him was a gamble, not on a certain destination, but on the possibility of transformation. And as he followed, he felt something inside him begin to shift. It wasn't just the landscape changing. The sky seemed less oppressive, the wind cooler. It was as if the boy's presence could alter not just the physical path, but the cowboy's very state of mind. The cowboy stood still for a moment, watching the boy slowly walk away. The dust kicked up by those small steps, mixed with the heat shimmering in the air, creating a sense of unreality. His instincts screamed at him to keep his distance. He had learned, over years of roads and wrong decisions, that trusting too quickly could come at a steep price. People smiled, offered help, and behind the scenes they kept intentions that only showed themselves when it was already too late. The boy stopped, as if sensing the hesitation. He turned slightly, his gaze steady, almost defiant. There was no fear there, no anxiety. It was a calmness that to the cowboy felt far too strange for a boy that age, in that place. That silent courage unsettled him, because it shook his own mindset. He, a hardened man, was locked in an invisible duel with a boy who had barely spoken a word. He thought about turning his back and going his own way. After all, he was already used to solitude, and the last time he got too close to someone, he lost more than he was willing to risk. But something about this moment wouldn't let him simply walk away. It wasn't pity nor obligation. It was as if there was a hidden truth in that exchange of glances, something beyond reason, yet heavy enough to feel like an inevitable decision. Now I want to go. Even deeper into this, because there are moments in life when logic alone isn't enough to define your next step. They're moments of silent tension, where the real impact lies not in what's said, but in what's felt. And it's in this kind of encounter that revelations arise, the kind that can change the course of an entire journey. Sometimes courage isn't about shouting or fighting, but simply standing your ground, holding a gaze, and waiting to see if the other will back down. The cowboy felt that if he let the boy disappear into the horizon, he would forever carry the doubt of what he might have discovered. And for someone who had already lost so much, one more loss, even if it was just the loss of an opportunity, seemed like a burden too heavy to bear. Still, his feet felt anchored to the ground, as if each step would be a pact he wasn't sure he wanted to sign. The boy, on the other hand, showed no urgency. He seemed to know the right timing for things, as if he'd learned that important decisions need to be respected at their own pace. He simply waited, standing tall, chin slightly raised, as if to say, "The choice is yours." And it was in that pause, in that space between fear and curiosity, that the cowboy realized the tension wasn't a signal to pull away, but to pay even closer attention. It was like standing before a closed gate, not knowing what lay beyond, yet sensing deep down that opening, it could lead to a place he would never find on his own. The wind lifted a fine curtain of dust as the boy took a few steps toward the cowboy. There was no hurry in his movements, but no hesitation either. He stopped just a few feet away, raised his small hand, and revealed a metal canteen worn by time. The surface was scratched, but the faint slosh of water inside sounded more precious than any treasure. The cowboy's eyes locked on it, as if it were a miracle in the middle of the desert. The boy said nothing. He simply held out the canteen, and that simple gesture broke the tension like a stone tossed into a still lake. Instinctively, the cowboy looked around as if needing to make sure this wasn't a trap. But the desert was empty, and the silence around them only reinforced that this moment was real. He took the canteen cautiously, feeling the cold metal against his rough hand. He took a sip, and the water, warm and slightly salty, seemed to wash not only the dryness from his throat, but also something deeper, as if cleansing a forgotten layer of distrust. That's when the boy smiled. Not a wide or childish smile, but an almost imperceptible gesture, like someone silently confirming they had done what needed to be done. Then he turned and pointed with his chin toward a direction on the horizon. The gesture was a silent invitation to follow him. There were no promises, no guarantees, only that inexplicable feeling that this path hid something worth discovering. The cowboy felt a knot in his stomach. Following meant giving up the control he had always kept over his steps, and he knew well the weight of that. But something in that simplicity had an impact he couldn't explain. It was as if, after so many years of making decisions in the heat of necessity or the cold of fear, he now faced a different choice, one that required nothing but trust. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because there are moments in life when a small gesture carries more strength than the grandest speeches. True transformation often begins this way, with something so simple that at first glance it seems insignificant. But it's precisely in simplicity that the power lies to break down defenses, to open doors that years of insistence could never unlock. The boy's smile and the offered canteen were more than hospitality. They were a silent reminder that sometimes following is not a sign of weakness, but of courage. The cowboy realized this wasn't just an offer of water. It was an invitation to a journey that went beyond dust and dry trails. It was a chance to uncover a hidden truth, to walk a path that might lead him back to parts of himself he thought he'd lost. And without knowing exactly why, he took the first step. The sound of his boots in the sand, echoing right behind the boy, felt like the start of something new. Not an ending, but an opening to revelations that were about to unfold. The cowboy followed the boy along a narrow path that seemed to form only for those who truly knew where they were going. The heavy sound of the cowboy's boots blended with the boy's light, almost silent steps, and with each stride the landscape began to shift subtly. The sandy ground gave way to firmer soil, marked by old footprints and nearly invisible signs the cowboy would never have noticed on his own. There was no rush, but there was no pause either. It was as if the rhythm was dictated by something unseen, a silent beat only the two of them shared. Every now and then, the boy would point to something on the horizon or to markings on the ground, explaining in just a few words what they meant. The cowboy, used to relying solely on his own instincts, realized there was a world of information that had always been in front of his eyes, but that he had never learned to interpret. Each gesture from the boy was a lesson: how to read the direction of the wind by watching the movement of plants, how to spot a water source by the subtle change in the color of rocks, or how to sense the approach of animals just from the sudden silence around them. Between these small exchanges, there were long periods of silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was full of meaning, as if they both understood that not everything needed to be spoken. Sometimes the boy would glance back just to make sure the cowboy was still there, and when their eyes met, no words were needed. It was a simple understanding. Walking together was enough. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because there are times when true transformation doesn't come from grand revelations, but from almost invisible details. A journey side by side, even without a clear destination, can change the mindset of someone who has always believed they had to face everything alone. It's in the background of these small interactions that trust is built, and trust is the foundation for any lasting change. The cowboy began to notice something curious. The more he learned from the boy, the less the weight of the past seemed to suffocate him. It wasn't that the memories had stopped existing, but it was as if each new step placed a layer of distance between him and the decisions that had scarred him. The boy, with his calmness and certainty, seemed to embody a hidden truth the cowboy had never allowed himself to consider, that you don't have to carry everything alone to be strong. The journey continued with small, strategic pauses. In the shade of a twisted tree, the boy offered him a piece of dry bread, and eating there, shared. Between the two, had a taste unlike any meal the cowboy could remember. It wasn't just food, it was a symbol that, in that moment, he wasn't alone. At the end of a gentle climb, the horizon opened before them, revealing a narrow valley where green began to timidly appear. The sound of running water reached the cowboy's ears, and he felt that beyond the physical relief, something emotional was happening as well. This journey wasn't just taking him to a new place on the map, but also to a point within himself he had thought lost forever. The valley stretched before them like a living painting, contrasting with the arid land they had left behind. The sound of water softly breaking against the rocks seemed to set a new rhythm for the journey. The cowboy breathed deeply, feeling the cooler air fill his lungs, and realized how small details, the shadows cast by trees, the scent of wet earth, the distant song of a bird, had the power to soothe something that had been restless inside him for years. The boy walking ahead moved with the ease of someone who knew every curve of the place, and the cowboy noticed that, until that moment, he hadn't asked anything about where they were going. It wasn't neglect or lack of curiosity. It was something else. It was the sense that the final destination mattered less than the walk itself. He no longer felt the urgent need for answers, and that, in itself, was a quiet transformation. When the boy stopped by the stream, knelt down, and began filling the canteen, the cowboy watched, noticing how each movement was careful, as if that simple act carried respect for something greater. They sat together on the bank, unhurried. The boy broke off another piece of bread, and this time, the cowboy understood that it wasn't just food being offered, but a kind of unspoken pact. You are welcome here. And in that instant, he realized that trust isn't built with promises or speeches, but with gestures repeated in the simplicity of everyday life. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because most people believe that great changes happen in dramatic moments, in spectacular turning points. But in truth, mindset begins to take shape in the details, in the background of seemingly ordinary interactions. It's when you allow yourself to observe, to learn, and to open up to small revelations that you start to understand the journey isn't just geographic, it's internal. And it's that internal change that determines how you will face whatever comes next. As the sun moved across the sky, casting golden light over the surface of the water, the cowboy began to speak. Not much, just scattered fragments of his life, as if testing the ground. The boy listened in silence, and that uninterrupted listening made him feel less judged and more understood. It was strange, almost uncomfortable, to realize he could talk about things he had buried so deep, but at the same time, it was freeing. The boy didn't respond with advice, only with steady looks and the occasional gesture of understanding, and somehow that was enough. The cowboy realized that in this exchange there was no hierarchy. It wasn't the older man teaching the younger, nor the younger seeking protection. It was simply an encounter between two journeys that, by chance or by fate, had crossed paths. The sun was already starting to dip when the boy stood up, signaling it was time to move on. The cowboy rose with him, feeling that this path, wherever it led, was already doing more for him than years of solitude ever had. There was something in the air, perhaps expectation, perhaps just the sense that certain stories can only be told with your feet, one step at a time. The trail began to climb gently, and the air felt heavier, charged with something the cowboy couldn't name. The boy kept the same steady pace, looking ahead as if he already knew every stone and shadow along the way. The cowboy, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of calm and unease. It was like walking towards something you hadn't asked for, but somehow already knew you needed to find. After a while, the boy stopped. He stayed silent, looking toward the horizon, and motioned for the cowboy to come closer. The man took a few steps, and when he stood beside him, the boy spoke for the first time since they had begun walking together. His voice was low but clear, as if saying something that could not be misunderstood. "The path leads to her." The cowboy frowned, confused. "Who?" he asked, unable to hide the weight in his voice. The boy looked at him for a moment, then turned his gaze forward again. "Your mother." The word hit him like silent thunder. It had been so many years since he had even spoken that name that for a moment he wondered if he had heard right. The memory of her face came to him with painful clarity. Those steady eyes, that voice he knew could be sweet, but which, the last time he heard it, had been heavy with disappointment. He thought he had closed that door forever, burying with it any possibility of return. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because there are truths that cannot stay hidden forever. They remain there, in the background of our memory, waiting for the right moment to surface. And when they do, they have the power to dismantle the defenses we've spent years building. The cowboy's journey, up to that moment, had seemed like nothing more than physical movement, a twist of fate that placed him alongside a mysterious boy. But now, with just those few words, everything took on a different meaning. The revelation carried an impact he didn't know how to handle. It wasn't only about meeting someone from his past. It was about confronting the decisions that had driven him away from her, about facing memories he had spent a lifetime avoiding. From that point on, each step was no longer just a movement through space, but an internal crossing, a path toward reconnection. The boy said nothing more. He kept walking, as if he knew silence was the only language capable of holding the weight of that information. The cowboy followed, but now his mind was flooded with images and sounds that didn't come from the present. He remembered the stories his mother told when he was still a boy, the advice he had chosen to ignore in his youth, and above all, he remembered the day he left without saying goodbye. The landscape around them seemed to respond to his inner turmoil. The trees closed in more tightly over the path. The light filtered through in narrow beams, and every sound of the forest seemed to echo louder. It was as if the very environment was preparing him for what was to come. He didn't know if he was ready to see her face again, but one thing was certain: there was no turning back. The path narrowed until the forest began to open into a small clearing. Sunlight streamed through the tall leaves, drawing golden patterns on the ground. At the center of the space stood a simple house, built from weathered wood, holding its ground against time. The cowboy stopped for a moment, unable to move his feet. His heart pounded as if trying to warn him that he was about to cross an invisible threshold. The boy looked back, his expression calm, and motioned for him to come closer. The cowboy drew in a deep breath and stepped forward. Each stride felt heavier than the last, not from physical strain, but from the weight of the memories rising to the surface. When he was close enough to see the door of the house begin to open, the world seemed to slow down. She appeared in the doorway with the same upright posture he remembered, though time had etched soft lines into her face. Her hair, now lighter and streaked with silver, fell over her shoulders. Her eyes, those same steady eyes, found him instantly. There were no words, only a silence that spoke more than any speech could. The cowboy felt his throat tighten. For a moment he thought about looking away, but he couldn't. She took one step, forward, then another, until they stood just inches apart. He noticed the slight trembling in her hands as if she were trying to contain the avalanche of feelings threatening to break free. Then, without warning, she embraced him. It was a firm embrace, heavy with years accumulated, with repressed longing and all the things left unresolved. He caught that familiar scent that instantly carried him back to a time when he still believed nothing could separate them. His eyes closed, and the pressure in his chest finally found its release in the silent tears that began to fall. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because there are reunions that are not merely physical, but spiritual. It's as if, in that instant, past and present intertwined, dissolving the distances created by decisions and by time. A true reunion isn't just about seeing someone again. It's about feeling something you believed was lost forever. The impact is so profound that it reshapes how you view your own story. Neither of them spoke right away. They remained there, holding the embrace, letting silence do the work of healing what words perhaps could not. Slowly, she pulled back just enough to hold his face in her hands. There was no judgment in her gaze, only deep recognition, as if she understood that his journey to this moment had been necessary. The cowboy realized there was no longer any way to run from who he was or what he had done. But he also understood that this moment wasn't about guilt. It was about reconciliation, about reclaiming the part of himself that had always belonged to that bond. In the background, the boy watched silently, a faint smile on his face, as if he knew his role was fulfilled. For a few moments, the cowboy stayed there, feeling the warmth of that embrace slowly fade, but leaving behind something unseen. It was as if an old weight had slipped from his shoulders without him even realizing he had been carrying it. His mother stepped back, and with a gentle nod invited him inside. The boy was already seated on the porch step, gazing at the horizon as if the next part of the story no longer depended on him. Inside the house, the scent of fresh coffee and aged wood filled the air. The walls held yellowed photographs, small frozen memories in time, silently telling the story of a family once broken and now slowly being rebuilt. The cowboy let himself be carried by each detail, as if he were walking not only through a home, but through chapters of himself that had long been forgotten. As he sat at the table, he realized there was no rush to explain everything. Neither of them needed to race to fill the years of distance with words. Something far more valuable was happening there, the silent reconnection that only time and experience can allow. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because life has a peculiar way of guiding us, even when we insist on believing we're in control. Sometimes it uses broken roads, unlikely encounters, and even prolonged silences to bring us exactly to the point where we needed to be, even if at first we couldn't see why. Small gestures, which may seem insignificant in the moment, can become the spark for transformations that change entire destinies. The cowboy understood that if he hadn't accepted the canteen of water, if he hadn't taken that first step after the boy, none of this would be happening. The decision had seemed small, almost irrelevant, but the impact was immense, and this is one of the hidden truths most people only realize later. Life rarely presents its turning points with clear signs. More often than not, they arrive disguised as coincidence. The boy, still outside, seemed oblivious to the conversation that wasn't happening, but his presence was a living reminder that no one arrives alone where it truly matters. The cowboy knew there was still much to be said, wounds to face, and questions to be asked, but for the first time in a long time, he felt no rush. That moment was not the end of a journey, but the beginning of another, and somehow he knew he was exactly where he needed to be, at the right time, with the right people, and with the rare chance to rewrite the course of his own story. If you've made it this far, It's because this story spoke to you in a special way. Leave a like as a gesture of reciprocity, showing that this narrative meant something to you. That feedback is what gives me the strength to keep bringing stories that inspire, move, and transform. And go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because that's how we keep walking together on every new journey I share here. Every story you follow helps keep this space alive and carries further the messages that can change destinies. And tell me in the comments, write "I'm with you until the end," so I know you lived every detail of this journey with me. There's another story right here that will move you. Click it and keep going with me there.